Yeah, so I'm Maribel. I'm a third-year PhD student and I'm working at the Department of Biochemistry here at Oxford. So my research is basically focusing on a very specific group of proteins that basically help or are responsible in your cell to protect you when the cell is fighting an infection. So say you get like a little cut in your skin, some pathogens are coming in, bacteria for example, into that tiny little wound, and then your innate immune system needs to immediately come in and protect you against that challenge. But all this process also needs to be regulated, restricted in time, but also in space to that wound. Otherwise, say your entire arm would start to be inflamed and eventually the tissue would die, and that would be really bad. And I'm looking at a class of proteins that is basically called negative regulators of inflammation. And I'm trying to understand how do they work, what do they do. The way I normally work and kind of research or investigate the function of those proteins is that we have to make the protein. So that is already for a lot of people, that's a fascinating kind of idea that I can, pick a specific protein from all the proteins in your body and say, I'm gonna go and make that now. And the way we do it is we have to basically gather the DNA that is encoding the information for your cells as well of how to make that protein. And then we basically take the DNA, we get it into expression systems, as we call them, which is just cells really. And so you can just basically kind of import with methods from molecular biology, the DNA into those expression systems, and then they will make the protein for you based on the DNA that you have presented to them. And then there is a not very trivial way of purifying the protein out of the cells. And that is what I actually do most of the day, expressing proteins and purifying them. My PhD is mostly lab-based. I think 80 to 90% of the time I'm working in the lab. So that means on a typical day, I just, I wake up, I go to the lab, arrive at around 9, and then I start with my experiments. And then that can carry on for 6 hours, 8 hours, depending on how many steps you need to do. And then if, say something takes several days, you also know how to keep it happy overnight when you can't take care of it. And we also have some instruments that we can actually run overnight. And so, yeah, most of the time I am working in the lab. So I'm mainly focusing on 3 proteins, and one of them is a very well-known kind of negative regulator of inflammation. When you look up this protein online, you will find thousands of articles, mostly clinical studies, looking at patients who might have mutations in the gene describing that protein. So that will lead to them making a version of the protein that has a tiny mistake or a little fault. And mistakes in that protein have been connected in patients with chronic inflammatory diseases. So examples would be arthritis or lupus. And that basically means that because they are missing a vital function of one of these negative regulators of inflammation in their cells, they cannot cope with inflammation, with infection properly any longer. And that leads to chronic, so constant inflammation of certain tissues. All this very mechanistic insight that I'm providing can be used then by pharmacologists and downstream to then think about, okay, how can we design inhibitors of the protein if it's overactive, or how can we support the cells or the affected tissue to kind of substitute for the function of the protein in case it's not working. So something that really surprised me about my research was that, especially because I was coming from a different field and I didn't have that much experience, hands-on experience as well in protein biochemistry, I was surprised by how the old skills that I used to use when I was working as a geneticist could help me to learn something completely different. So basically these, transferable things that people talk about, but then really it doesn't have to be something that you can already do and then, use the exact same thing somewhere else, but it's more about knowing how to learn a new technique, or knowing how you're gonna get your head around a new kind of problem that is completely different, but you still have this kind of approach, this way of approaching a problem. So I was actually, shocked to a certain degree because I really didn't expect for things to be much different. And I think that was, a little bit of the mistake, because I lived in the States and in Canada before, and I was like excited to move abroad, but I was expecting for my daily life to not really change that much. But when I then arrived and the first couple of months honeymoon phase is over, I started to realize this is actually, my daily life is very different. Not only the language, food, like where do I go to buy the kind of things that I like, and what do I do in terms of like culture, where do I meet people. I think it took me at least a year to really like adapt to it. I mean, it's great. Like, I think when I came to Oxford to visit it for the first time for one of my interviews, I already knew that this was going to be a special experience if I was fortunate enough to come here for my studies. And Oxford is definitely holding up to its expectations, at least in my case. For me, that's mostly coming down to this incredible amount of awesome people who are studying here. And there's so many projects, so many initiatives. You can really expand your kind of like, the things that you've been thinking about, the ideas that you had by engaging with all the people who work here. And I found that incredibly stimulating. But at the same time, I mean, most of my PhD was during the pandemic. So I think it was also very challenging for me to study and work abroad while so much restrictions were in place. So if someone was asking me about PhDs and asking for my advice, I think this is such an extraordinary experience. If someone is really passionate about something, it doesn't have to be the entire package, but if someone feels some sort of like urge to follow up either on a topic or a technique or just wants to work in a specific environment, I would say go for it. And really don't be afraid about applying to like big names, supervisors, but also universities or programs, because you really don't know unless you've tried. Just going through the entire application process for a PhD was sort of a stressful experience. But I also really enjoyed it because so many researchers that are amongst the best in their field took out half an hour or 45 minutes of their day just to interview me and talk to me about science. And that was really the first time in my emerging career as a scientist that I felt like, oh my, someone is really like sitting down and listening to what I think about certain things. And I loved that. And I was like, well, it's only gonna get better during my PhD, so I really have to keep going. Yeah, so I am a student at Wolfson College, one of the big graduate colleges here at Oxford. And I am very involved with the college community, and I really like being in college, and I really enjoy knowing lots of faces around my college and helping with organizing events and really kind of like feeding that community because it's also feeding me. I really enjoy working with Wolfson on lots of different projects. And they've also really given me a great opportunity to start a kind of like series where I interview Black academics who have been at Wolfson at some point. So I really got the chance to invite some of those people back to the stage and really ask them about their experience and what, being at Oxford or studying at Wolfson 10, 15 years ago meant to them. Because, I've also come to realize that no matter how hard you work in the lab, especially as a person of color, as a woman in science, there's still going to be some sort of stages where it's not going to be enough. And, for me really looking into that, trying to understand what that means, where that's coming from and what can be done about it is a really big part of what I do when I'm not in the lab. And I play the violin and I really enjoy that as well.